Ooh, that looks tasty. Welcome folks to The Hungry Gamer is back with another mini review, and today we are talking about Dungeons of Infinity. Now, this one is one that I feel a little bit weird about doing the review for, not because I have an issue with the game or some kind of weird connection with the design or anything like that, but because it's real hard to get right now. In fact, when the Kickstarter delivered, there were extra copies out there, and they sold out within a couple of weeks. And because of the nature of this game being at least for what I'm interested in this game for, which is the solo co-op campaign, it was so much content with I don't know, 60-hour campaign to play through that, well, I couldn't get it done fast enough to where you could actually get a hold of it. Now, there is going to be a reprint, there is going to be an expansion, so you will have a chance. But right now, pretty much the only way you can get a hold of it is on the secondary market. So I always feel a little bit odd and a little bit awkward doing a review when, well, it's really hard to get right now. But that's it. So let's talk about what Dungeons of Infinity is. It is a traditional dungeon crawler. It's a traditional dungeon crawler with a campaign mode and with a competitive mode. And my understanding is the game was initially designed to be a competitive dungeon crawl where you have a scenario set up and the first person to actually complete the objective of the scenario, whether it be find a certain orb somewhere, or whether it be get enough money, get the most money and get back to the entrance, or kill the boss, or whatever. That kind of stuff, except you're doing it competitively, so you can go your own separate ways, or you can come and you could fight each other. There's also then a cooperative mode, which you can do one-off scenarios, or you can go through this big honking book. Now you can see my lights kind of glaring on there, but you can see it's a lot. Now, not all of this is the campaign. Some of it is the main just scenarios that you have, but you get an idea that it is a lot. The campaign is 30 consecutive missions. And as you're playing through the game, you'll be doing all the traditional dungeon crawler stuff. You're going to be finding new rooms, which are going to be randomized sometimes. Sometimes it's going to be preset for you. You're going to be leveling up. You're going to be getting new powers, new items. You're going to be buying stuff, blah, 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 doing all those things. What you really need to know is that this is a D20 based system. So all the dice that you're going to be rolling, you're going to be rolling a 20-sided die. And then along with that, the other thing you really need to know is that as you're playing through the campaign, the way it's broken down is into 10 chapters of 3 quests each. And each one of those has a specific hero that you must have with you in that chapter. And there's some others that are recommended. And so as you're playing through, each of these chapters has different events, and sometimes they're a little bit choose your own adventure style, sometimes they're not. But at the end of the day, after you finish the whole campaign, you will have played every single character at least 3 times, obviously probably more. And that's just kind of something else that I wanted to toss out there because that's not something that's common in most dungeon crawls. The final thing that I think you really need to know before I talk about my likes and my quibbles with this has to do with combat. You see, there are only standees for the heroes. And in the expansion coming up, there's going to be miniatures you can get, but only standees for the heroes and then the 3 big bosses. Other than that, everything is done by cards, and so combat is, in many ways, reminds me of kind of a JRPG where you're moving around on the board and then suddenly you come into combat and everything just kind of zooms down, and then you kind of place the cards out in a grid in front of your player board, and then if another player happens to come and attack, they can actually come from the other side. It's a little bit directional, but not really, and then you kind of play things out that way. Now, with all of that said very quickly, I understand that I'm relying on you having an idea of what a dungeon crawler is to kind of understand how this game works. But if you're checking out the review for a game called Dungeons of Infinity, you probably have an idea. So what do I like about this game? The first thing I will say is this. There's a lot of story here, and the story's pretty good. Is this the best story I've ever seen in a dungeon crawler? No, it's not the best, but it's better than a lot of them. It is pretty in-depth. There's a lot of text here. It's got some interesting character development. It's got some interesting stories in there, and it has some pretty strong twists and turns that, well, I did not see coming. And I like to think I'm a pretty smart nerd. So that's the first thing that I like. I also like that all the characters do feel very different. They play very differently with what their abilities are, and each one only has, I think it's 8 different cards or 10 card deck of abilities they have. but they really do feel like they are different. And they all feel like they make sense given the massive amount of story, backstory. I'm not talking about the book. I'm talking about the literal backstory. All of this here, whoop, I'll bring that up. All of this backstory that every single character has. But their abilities make sense based on this information here about who these different characters are. And so I really, really like that. Along with that, as you play through the campaign, I really like that it keeps things mixed up. And I'm going to throw out some broad examples here, but there's times when suddenly the whole dungeon starts shifting around. There's times where suddenly you find yourself popping up in different places all over. There's times when if you found the right thing, good for you. You found the thing, you can move on now, and you get to go to this point. There's other times when you have to make a choice. The person playing a certain character has to choose. Do I want to do this or do I want to do this? And depending on what you do, that changes the entire next scenario and will change things down the road. And I think it's actually quite well done. It is the way that the scenarios differ in what your objectives are really is done as well as any other dungeon crawler that I have played. Because we all know sometimes it can get boring if it's just go in, kill everything and move on. But this one is not like that. And I do definitely appreciate that. I also really appreciate what I mentioned earlier, how you're required to play through the different characters as you go through. And I really like that. One of the house rules I pretty much always make when I'm doing a campaign, if it has a whole bunch of characters, is I switch them in and out pretty regularly. And I'll switch out gear and whatever it might be because I want to play all of these characters. But I don't want to play through the entire campaign 5 or 6 times. And if I kept the same 3 or 4 characters, I would have to play through this campaign 2.5 times to be able to get all of them out. And no one has time for that. I want to play through the campaign, then I want to go and do one-shots or maybe try the competitive mode. I don't want to keep playing the campaign over and over and over again, but I want to feel like I'm getting to experience the whole game. And this campaign does quite a good job of that. I'm also going to say that I appreciate the gender balance of the game. I don't know if it's 50-50, but it's pretty much half male, half female. There is a solid amount of representation as far as race in the characters. They are mostly white, but not completely white. But considering the state of the fantasy genre, this game is doing a pretty good job. In this game, the women in the game are just as cool as the dudes, and they're not stupidly dressed, so good on them. And then the last thing that I will comment on that I enjoy is I do enjoy the way combat works in the sense that you have a static amount of damage that you're going to do. And you know that you've been tracking it as you level up, as you get items or whatever it is. You simply have on your track here, you simply have your power, which I know it's a little hard to see here. I should have put up a picture, but I didn't. You have this tracker that's going up, and that is how much damage you are going to do. And then you might be using a card or something, and that might boost your damage or change it. But it's very clear. It's very static. It's that you take away the enemy's armor value. If you hit, done, move on. So it does keep the amount of dice that you're rolling relatively low, and I certainly always appreciate that. I like when combat is quick and simple. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not more to it. I'm going to talk about that in just a minute, and that's going to bring me into one of my quibbles with the game. The first one is combat can feel swingy, and part of that, I think, is the fact that it uses the 20-sided die, and 20-sided dice feel swingy. Anyone who's ever played Dungeons and Dragons or any of those games, you know you start rolling your 20-sided die and you get 20, 20, 20, you feel great. In this game, that's horrible because you want to roll low, but it can feel like you just can't hit. And even if the odds are the same, D20s to me feel very swingy. And this game is no different, except it kind of expands throughout the whole game. Sometimes you're doing scenarios that are random, and so you're just drawing tiles, and there's certain tiles that you need to be able to win, and they're on the bottom, and you just can't get there, and you feel like you're waiting forever, and you're just getting beaten on as you're trying to get there. Or as you're drawing things out of these different risk decks as you're going through and finding different things. Again, sometimes you can get good. You step into the mist, nothing happens. You step into the mist, maybe you find something good. Other times, you just keep getting wailed on and drawing enemy, and there's nothing you can do about it. In fact, I will say the very first game that I played, the very first dungeon that I entered, the very first room that I entered, I got jumped and I got killed on the first round. First round of the game. And that can happen. Obviously, I should have waited and gone in later or whatever, but that is a thing that can happen. And I posted in the Dungeons of Infinity Facebook group, and other people say, oh yeah, something like that happened. That's a real bad draw. Sometimes you just get a real bad draw. and that can happen. The game is swingy in that regard, especially early on where you can just get wailed on if you draw the right enemies that have the right elemental attacks that are your weakness, and you get hit by all of them, suddenly you can get leveled. And that might not be something that you enjoy. The swinginess of the D20 systems and the swinginess of the whole game. It's a lot of randomness put in there, which might not be your thing. And then my other quibble is a production thing. Now, what they did in this game is they went for these sliders here. Again, it's not the easiest to see, but these things kind of slide up and down, which is fine, it's kind of neat. But the problem is, on some of them, they just don't work. And people on Facebook said, oh, you just got to take a paperclip and got to dig it in there and move things. But I don't want to deal with that. I don't want to possibly mess my thing up. So like for this guy right here, my paladin, I just literally can't get these things in. They don't move on this one. And it worked out okay. I just said, you know what, forget about it. And I was using a dry erase marker because it actually, the surface, I don't know if it was intended that way, but the surface of these works perfectly for dry erase markers. And I just marked things that way and was perfectly happy. And actually, it wound up being a boon because as I got things that maybe boosted my hit chance, I was just literally changing these numbers as I went. But again, it's just the idea to get to these sliders was a good one, but they just don't work great in all instances. And because these things are pointy, you actually have to put something on top of these or they will ding up the back of your player boards, and that to me is a bummer. But really, that's it, folks. That is Dungeons of Infinity. I think if you are a dungeon crawler fan and you like the idea of being able to play and have a randomly generated dungeon, because that is a fun way to play the game, because every time you get a different tile, and based on whatever tile that you draw, you wind up looking at one of these little charts here and it tells you what type of things on that, what kind of risk is on that tile. That is fun. And the combat is enjoyable when you're into it, as long as you don't mind that sometimes it's going to feel unfair. And sometimes it's going to feel like you're just waxing everything because it is swingy. But if you're the type of person who doesn't mind that, and most importantly, if you're the type of person that is looking for a dungeon crawler that you can play in under 2 hours and that has big time story, then this is one that you want to check out. Now, if you don't care about story and you're looking for a dungeon crawler right now that is just going to get in, chuck some dice, kill some things, then this is definitely not the one for you. I think this game is at its strongest when you're doing that campaign. And if you're looking for deep, crunchy mechanics, this isn't really it. Yes, you have some bonuses here and there, but it's not crunchy mechanics. It's not strategic combat. It's none of that stuff. So if that's what you're looking for, this won't be the game for you. But all in all, I've enjoyed playing Dungeons of Infinity. I think, honestly, it is a far stronger game than I ever thought it would be based off of the campaign and what I looked at to begin with. I think it's a game that has room to be developed, has room to maybe be streamlined a little more when the expansion comes. But it's one that if you are a fan of dungeon crawlers, you're a fan of story, and the story and the journey is perhaps more important than all of the crunch and mechanics and the throwing of dice, and this is one you probably want to check out. As always, if you found this video useful, please like, subscribe, and share. Thank you so much for watching. Have a wonderful day.